thrilled to be hosting our very first panel with the Japanese presentation and interpretation. This panel would not have been possible without Mr. Nick Millward from the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies and Dr. Borjigin Husel, who is a professor in the Department of International Studies at Showa Women's University, and Dr. Stuart Goldman, who is an American historian and author of the Nomonhan 1939, are here. So, and Mrs. Madoka Suda, who is helping us with interpretation of Dr. Husel's presentation, who's joining us from Tokyo. So we're very excited. We have a really interesting topic of the Battle of Khalkhyn Gol, or the Nomonhan Incident. So first, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Nick Millward, who is from the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies, or YCAPS, who's been very tremendous help in co-organizing this. So I'd like to give the floor to Nick.
Thank you, Natsu. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for our presenters and for everyone tuning in tonight. If you're in Japan, thanks for staying up late until 10 o'clock at night for this to start. I appreciate it. Like Natsu said, I'm the Senior Director for International Development and the Senior Director for International Development for YCAPS. And I also run the YCAPS Mongolia Connect program, which is designed to strengthen and foster relations between Japanese, Mongolians, and Americans. YCAPS is a nonprofit, an American nonprofit based out of Yokosuka, Japan, and we are designed to create educational opportunities, whether that's seminars, trips, or webinars for the public, free of charge. And so that's it for me. I just want to say thanks for letting us co-promote this with you, Natsu. And again, thank you everybody for staying up late tonight or waking up early in the US.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. I am going to ask Dr. Husel and Mrs. Madoka for the spotlight. Dr. Husel is, as I said before, a professor at Showa Women's University in Tokyo, Japan. He's been there since 2016. He earned his Ph.D. and his MA at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. In 2012, he was a fellow at the University of Cambridge's Department of Social Anthropology, focusing in the Mongolian Inter-Asia Studies Unit. Dr. Husel has an impressive list of published articles, chapters, including the New Archive of Mongolia, Russia, and China, to elucidate the Battle of Khalkhyn Gol, the Nomonhan Incident, the Mongolian Epic of the Eurasian Grassland, and the Battle of Khalkhyn Gol, the Nomonhan Incident, from an international perspective. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Husel and Mrs. Madoka Suda.
皆さん、こんばんは。おはようございます。
Good morning. Good morning and good evening, everyone.
ご紹介どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for introduction.
まずこの会を企画したニーク会長、ナルンツォクト様、私を推薦していただいた川野仁教授、そして通訳をご担当していただくスタマトカ様に心より御礼申し上げます。
First, I would like to thank Mr. Millward, Mr. Narska, Dr. Kawano, who recommended me, and Ms. Suda, who is assisting me with translation today.
また、ゴールドマン先生に再会でき、非常に嬉しいです。
Also, I am very glad to see Dr. Goldman again.
私は2009年以降、春葉川ノモハン戦争をテーマとする国際シンポジウムを9回、東京ウランバートル、モスクワで実施してきて、論文集を4冊出版しました。どうぞ。
Since 2009, I hosted an international conference related to the Battle of Khalkhyn River and the Nomonhan in Ulaanbaatar, Tokyo, and Moscow about 9 times. And I also published 4 journal collection books.
こうしたシンポジウムを通して各国の研究者と意見を交換することができ、ハルハ川ノモハン戦争と関係する新発見の歴史記録、各界の最新の研究成果を総括することができ、そのおかげで昨年自分の船長、モンゴル、ロシア、中国の新資料から読み解くハルハ川ノモハン戦争を出版することができました。
I had an opportunity to discuss and exchange information with researchers from around the world at international conferences. I also discovered new historical records regarding the Battle of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan and recap the newest research. I achieved to publish my book last year, which is the policies of the Communist Party and the Kuomintang towards Inner Mongolia.
今日の報告は長期の書籍にあまり強調できなかったいくつかの点について報告したいと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Today, I would like to talk about a few topics that I was not able to cover in my. Thank you.
自分が用意した原稿を読ませていただきます。
I prepared my script, so I would like to read through the presentation.
長い間、ハルハ川ノモハン戦争をめぐる諸研究は様々な角度から行われてきました。
As widely known, research shows the cause of the battle is difference in perspectives. For a long time, many researchers conducted research on the Battle of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan from the various perspectives.
よく知られているように、ハルハ川ノモハン戦争が起こった理由についての一説は、戦った双方の国境線に対する認識が異なっていることと関係しています。
As rightly known, research shows the cause of the battle is difference in perception of the borderline of the territory.
モンゴル、ソ連側がハルハ川の東岸より18から20キロないし13キロ以内の地域を領有すると認識しているに対し、日本、満州国側は国境線がハルハ川にあると主張する。
The Mongolia and the Soviet Union forces claimed the borderline was about 8 to 12 miles on the east coastline from Khalkhyn River. However, the Japan and Manchuria forces claimed the borderline was inside the river.
したがって我々は焦点を国境地域に当てると、そこには2つの交差点あるいは交差ラインがあることがわかる。
Thus, there were two crossing points on the borderline.
その一つは日本、満州国側が主張するハルハ川であり、もう一つはモンゴル、ソ連側が主張する新政府により定められたハローを境とする国境線です。
So one is claimed by Japan and Manchuria, which is Khalkhyn River side. Another one is claimed by Mongolia and the Soviet Union, which is divided by the pillboxes built by the same government.
陽政12年、つまり1734年、新政府がハルハとフルンボイルの間の16のハローを設けました。
In 1734, the Queen government built pillboxes between Halha, which is outer Mongolia, and Fulinbor.
現在の国境線は基本的に停戦後の1939年11月19日と1940年7月18日にモスクワで定められたノモハン紛争発生地域の満蒙国境確定委員会に関する覚書 A と B、および1941年10月にハルビンで調印された 協定書によって定められたラインを維持しています。
The current borderline is determined based on the regulations regulated on November 19th, 1939 and November 18th, 1940 in Moscow and October 1941 in Harbin.
ノモンハンプルトボはほぼ国境線の真ん中に位置します。
The Nomonhan Bordeaux is located almost back center of the borderline.
この国境線はマナー山を含むハンダガイ、ハロンアルシャン一帯の西の一部の土地を除いて、基本的に新政府が定められた境界線を継承しています。
The borderline was maintained by Queen government except Mount Maya, Handagaya, and the west side of the Khalkhyn Ocean.
ハルハ川ノモンハンに立って、日本満州国軍とソ連モンゴル軍の戦闘の備え作戦、攻防、戦線の移動を見ると、いくつか意外なことが見えてきます。
When you stand at Nomonhan and Khalkhyn River, you will notice few interesting things related to defense, offense, and movements of each forces.
これはハルハ川ノモンハン戦争研究におけるいくつかの盲点を埋め、さらに同戦争におけるいくつか革新的問題、すなわち戦った双方の戦略的優劣、勝敗の根源などに迫ることもできます。
Those will fulfill blind sides of research and would approach to some core issues which are merits and results of the battle.
私は2009年以降、モンゴル国やロシア、中国の諸文書館で資料を収集したほか、ハルハ川ノモンハンの戦場、タムスクボルグや将軍病、ガンチュル病、ハロンアルシャンといった旧ソ連軍、日本軍により導入された軍事拠点と広報の軍事施設について調査を行ってきました。
I have collected information in libraries in Mongolia and China since 1999, as well as we researched locations of the battlefields and the Soviet Union and Japan facilities.
何度もハルハ川国境線に立って左右の戦場、領土を見渡し、感慨深くハルハ川ノモンハン戦争について考えさせられ、それまでのいくつかの見方を見直しました。
And I thought the battles when I stand at the Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan and review my thoughts and perspective toward the war.
今日の報告はハルハ川と停戦後に定められた国境線という2つの交差点に立って、ハルハ川ノモンハン戦争、とりわけ橋をめぐる攻守、戦争全体における双方空軍の越境空襲、布陣の変化、推移、攻防の的を捉え、再検討することを目的とします。
The purpose of this report is to reconsider the battles from the perspective of the bridge and the aerial attack over the borderline and targets.
まず、ハルハ川からハルハ川ノモンハン戦争を見ると何が見えるかを述べたいです。
I would like to talk about the perspective from Khalkhyn River.
ハルハ川はソ連モンゴル軍の天然の障壁であると言われています。
The Khalkhyn River is also called as nature wall.
しかし日本満州国側の主張に従い、ハルハ川を境界線としたら、この天然の障壁は障壁にならなくなります。
However, if the borderline is set as Japanese Manchurian border, it would not be the nature wall.
なぜかというと、ハルハ川を境界線とする場合、川の両側の軍隊、すなわち東岸からやってくる日本満州国軍と西岸のソ連モンゴル軍の渡河の 可能性は均等的になります。
Because the possibility of crossing the river from the east side, which was Japanese Mongolian side, and the west side, the Soviet Union Mongolia side, would be equal.
これハロハ川。
So this is the Half River.
一旦日本満州国軍が東岸から渡河したら、その成功の可能性は 50% より低くないです。
So if Japan, Manchuria crossed the river, Soviet Union, Mongolia would be easily under the
ソ連モンゴル軍が遭遇する脅威は非常に大きくなります。
The Soviet Union and Mongolia will be damaged.
しかし、すいません。しかし、清朝時代に定められたハロル、すなわちソ連モンゴル側が主張したハロハ川東岸より18キロから20キロ、ないし13キロを境界線とする場合、ソ連モンゴル軍は自由に川の東岸に駐屯することができ、渡河の主導権は完全にソ連モンゴル側に握られるに対し、東側の日本満州国軍の渡河の可能性は大いに割り引かれ、ソ連モンゴル軍の天然の障壁としてのハロハ川の意義が大きくなります。
However, if the border was set up still in the Qing Dynasty government, which was a border claimed by the Soviet Union Mongolia, the Soviet Union Mongolia were able to cross the river easily. That would increase possibility of Japan Manchuria crossing the river drastically. In this sense, Soviet Union Mongolia would have advantage of having the nature wall.
時間関係でこの部分も省略します。これは当時、1939年7月初旬、日本軍がハロハ川を渡った時の写真です。
So this is the picture in July 1939. The Japanese forces are crossing the river.
これはモンゴル軍が後に川を渡る様子です。
So this is the Mongolian forces crossing the river.
ソ連軍の工兵が橋を作っています。
So this is the Soviet Union soldier who is building the bridge.
次、2の方の入りたいと思います。
I would like to talk about the second point.
国境線から見たハルハ川ノモハン戦争。で、ノモハンに立って、国境の両側を見てみましょう。
From now on, I would like to talk about the perspective from the borderline. Let's take a look at the both coastline of the border from Nomonhan.
ノモハンに立って国境の両側を見ると、双方の司令部の所在地、まず分析しますが、小松原道太郎の第23師団の司令部は6月27日に将軍廟に置かれ、中古風の第57特別軍団司令部は7月初頭にハマルタバーを置かれました。
So on June 27, 1939, the 23rd Infantry Division Command, led by the Commanding Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara, set the command post at the General Mausoleum. The Lieutenant General Gregory Zhukov's 57th Special Force Command set up their command post at Hamaldaban.
ソ連、モンゴル側が主張する国境線はちょうどこの2つの指揮所の真ん中になります。
The borderline claimed by the Soviet Union Mongolia was located in the center of the mentioned two command posts.
ノモンハンプルドオボはこの国境線の東側に位置します。
The Nomonhan Obo is located at the east side of the border.
すみません、一枚の地図が見つかる。 ノモハンプルドボからこの2つの式場までの距離はほぼ同じです。
So it was almost the same distance from the Nomonhan Bordeaux with each command post.
8月に入ると、ハルハ川という交差点の主導権は完全にソ連モンゴル軍の強固たるものになっています。
By August 1939, the Soviet Union Mongolian forces completely occupied the Khalkhyn River.
ソ連モンゴル軍の各部隊は途切れることがなく、次々とこのラインを渡り、東岸の各陣地に入った。
Their forces crossed the river and set up their base at the east coastline.
もう一つの交差点であるソ連モンゴル側が主張する国境線には、ハルハ川のような天然の障壁がなく、ソ連モンゴル軍が一旦このラインを越えると、ノモハンプルド・オボーや将軍病、ガンドル病、アロシャーは危険、極まりにない。
The Soviet Union Mongolia did not have the natural wall in the borderline. So once they crossed the river, Nomonhan Bordeaux General Mausoleum and Ganjor Mausoleum, which were Japan and Mongolian territory, would be in the taken by the Soviet Union and Mongolia.
したがって関東軍は懸命に戦場をソ連モンゴル側が主張する国境線より西、ホルスタイ川の両岸地域に限定しようと努めました。
Thus, Japan, Manchuria tried to keep the battle within the west of Soviet Union, Mongolia claimed borderline.
問題はソ連モンゴル軍が発動する対日満州国軍のその総攻撃の目標はどのようなものであったか言い換えれば、シュトルンやジュコフといった前線の指揮官たちがどのような戦果を得たかったか、総攻撃の日をなぜ8月20日にしたかということです。
The issues are what the Soviet Union Mongolia's target of the all-out offensive against Japan Manchuria, which means what Lieutenant General Zhukov and other frontline leaders wanted to achieve, and why the Soviet Union Mongolia set August 20th, 1939 as all-out offensive date.
実感関係でこの部分私2点を強調したいです。
I would like to emphasize 2 points with this point.
その一つはこの8月20日という日付を決めたのは従来の説ではジューコフという認識でした。
The Zhukov is the one to decide that August 20th is for all-out offensive dates, as widely known.
しかし実際はジュコフではなくシュトルンでした。
However, that was not the truth. Zhukov is not the one to decide the date. Zhukov is the one to decide the date.
もう一つは、これ全部省略します。すいません。終わりに入りたいです。空襲された探索ボログやバイントゥムン、ガンジュル病、将軍病、アラシャーなどの地域を除いて、ハルハ川ノマン戦争は主に南北74キロ、東西20キロの戦場で、展開されました。
Due to the time limit, he would like to skip few slides and go into a conclusion. The Battle of the Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan was occurred within the area approximately 45 miles from the north to south and approximately 12 miles from east to west, except Tamsang Bulag, and Bayan Tumen, Gunjo Mausoleum, General Mausoleum, and the Nomonhan of the border of Bo and Holstein River are located at the battlefield.
ノモハンプルド・オボーは、失礼しました。ノモハンプルド・オボーとホルスタイ川という軸はちょうどその真ん中に位置します。
Then again, the board of Bo and Holstein River are located in the center of the battlefield.
新朝時代に設置されたノモハンプルド・ハロールからハロハ川までの距離は約10キロです。
The distance from the Nomonhan pillbox, which was built in Qing Dynasty, to Khalkhyn River is approximately 6 miles.
その北東の約 2.5 キロのところにノモハンプルトがあって、そこからハイロルまでの距離は約195キロ余りになります。
Nomonhan pillbox is located approximately 1.5 miles northeast from that area, and from Nomonhan pillbox to Hiller district is approximately 101 miles.
で、ホルスタイ川はノモハンプルト山、ウルチトボルを源流とし、将軍病を経てノモハンプルトハロールの北から北西へと流れ、ハルハ川に注ぎます。
The Ojit Bordeaux in Mount Nomonhan Bullhead is the headwater of the Holstein River. The river passes General Mausoleum, goes to the Nomonhan Bordeaux pillbox from north to southwest, then march to Khalkhyn River.
ハルハ川の東岸、ホルスタイ川の南岸、川俣に近いところにクイ高地があります。
The Kui Highland is located in the area of east coastline of Khalkhyn River and south coastline of the Holstein River.
このクイ高地は都下と関わる最も重要な高地である。
The Kui Highland is the important location related to Khalkhyn and the Holstein rivers.
そのため5月から同高地をめぐる戦いが激しく繰り返されました。
And this area was one of the most the terrible battlefields since May 1939.
5月からクイ高地の東南にノロ高地が立つ。
Then Nola Highland is the south of the Kui Highland.
ノロ高地の南部は大砂丘群となっています。
The large dune groups is located south of Nola Highland as well.
この大砂丘群は南東部のアルシャン、ハンダガイからハルハ川ノモハン戦場への侵入口になります。
This large dune group was an entrance to the battlefield of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan.
ノロ高地と対面するホルスタイ川の北岸にバルシャンガル高地、モンゴルとロシアではリミーゾフ高地と言っていますが、リミーゾフ高地があります。
The Limitov Highland is located at the north of Holstein River, which is across from the Nolo Highland.
そのさらに北の方も元のシリンホトハロルに近いところにフィー高地があります。
The Fui Highland is located at the north of Holstein River, which the north of the Khalkhyn River.
フィ高地は北部、すなわちガンチュル病からハルハ川ノモンハン戦場の中心部への侵入口になります。
So Hui Highland is an entrance of the center of the battlefield.
ノロ高地とリミゾフ高地はそれぞれホルスタイ川、南北の岸を守る最も重要な軍事的要衝の位置を占めます。
But those highland is very important locations to protect.
ホルスタイ川と隣接するノモンハンプルトボは北東部の将軍廟連火山からホルスタイ川両岸への侵入口になります。
The Nomonhan Borough is located close to the Khalkhyn River, and it is an entrance to both banks of the Khalkhyn River.
ごめんなさい、私逆にした。この6つの要衝において、ノモンハンプルドボは国境線の印となっており、残った5つの要衝はいずれも日本モンゴル側が主張するハルハ川とソ連モンゴル側が主張する国境線といった2つのラインの間にあります。
Nomonhan Obo became a symbol of those 6 important locations, and other 5 important locations were on claimed border lines by Japan, Manchuria, and the Soviet Mongolia.
ハルハ川ノモハン戦争においてこの6つの要衝での戦いは壮絶的であったことはこうした地理的軍事的重要性があったからです。
The fierce battles were occurred at those 6 important locations due to the geographical and strategical significant reasons.
ソ連モンゴル軍は最も早い段階で日本満州国軍をクイ高地から追い散らすことができました。
The Soviet Mongolian force would have been able to Japanese Manchurian force from Kui Highland at the earliest time.
そして8月のソ連モンゴル軍の対日本満州国軍の総攻撃においてノロ高地、バルシャンガル高地、つまりリミゾフ高地、フィ高地での戦いは最も悲惨で、日満軍は独断撤退を余儀なくされました。
Battles at Nolo Highland, Balshgol Highland, Kui Highland were the most tragic during the all-out offensive in August, and Japanese Manchurian forces was forced to evacuate.
モスクワからシュトルンとジュコフに対して国境線を越えないようという命令があったにもかかわらず、ソ連モンゴル軍はノモンハンプルド・オボ、ウツールノールに対する攻撃において、手加減はしなかった。
The Soviet Mongolian forces, especially Air Force and Army, did not hold back to attack Nomonhan Obo and other areas, even though Kern and Zhukov were prohibited to cross the borderline from Moscow.
8月20日に発動された対日満軍総攻撃において、ソ連モンゴル軍の航空部隊と砲兵部隊の猛爆の後、決して足並みが揃ったとは言えないが、地上核部隊が北中南の3方面から日本満州国軍に対し攻撃をかけました。
The East Soviet Mongolian Land Corps attacked Japanese Manchurian forces from 3 directions after the all-out offensive occurred on August 20th, 1939.
北部集団の最も 北端に配置されたモンゴル第6騎兵師団とソ連軍の第15、17騎兵連隊が国境線まで進軍し、制圧した後、その南に、さらにソ連軍の第212皇帝旅団が増援され、最北部の国境線の攻防が強化されました。
The Mongolian 6th Cavalry Division and Soviet Union 15th and 17th Cavalry which were positioned at the northernmost point, proceeded to the borderline. Then Soviet Union 212th Airborne Brigade was reinforced and they strengthened the defense at the northmost borderline.
戦いを勝利へと導こうとすれば先を見越す必要があります。
If the victory of the battle was the goal, proactive approach is necessary.
またそれは国家の指導者と前線で戦いを指揮する現地の指揮官たちの立場も一致することが前提条件となります。
Also, it is critical to have the same strategy and opinion between leaders of the country and leaders at the battlefields.
しかし、戦果を重視する前線の指揮官たちは、戦場全体、ひいては兵隊補充まで視野に入れて考えることはできたとしても、往々にして国の戦略、国際情勢を見渡す余裕はありません。余裕はない。
Leaders at the battlefields are occupied to fight at the fields and formulate their plans for the victory.
国家の指導者は国の戦略、国際情勢を重んじており、前線の戦いをもちろん気にするが、戦場の隅々の特質まで配慮が行き届かない。
On the other hand, leaders of the country only consider national strategy in national affairs.
国家の指導者と前線の指揮官たちの考え方が一致しない場合、戦いは失敗に終わるか取り返しのつかない損失をもたらします。
When the leaders of the country and leaders of the battlefields disagree on plans and strategies, they would lose the battle and bring significant damage to the country.
失礼しました。モスクワ、ウランバートル、ハマルダバーと東京、新疆、将軍病を比較してみれば、ハロハ川ノモハン戦争においてソ連モンゴルと日本満州国といった双方の戦いは驚くほど似たところがあったことがわかります。
If you compare battles at Moscow to Ulaanbaatar to Hamardabar and Tokyo to Changchun to General Mausoleum, it is clear to see the similarities on strategy at the Battle of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan between Japan, Manchukuo, and Soviet Union, Mongolia.
日本満州国軍もソ連モンゴル軍も現地の指揮官たちは戦いを敵側の領土まで拡大しようとした。
Both Japanese, Manchurian, and Soviet Union, Mongolia forces attempted to expand territories.
しかしこれに対しモスクワと東京の指導者はいずれも自分の自ら主張した国境線を越えての攻撃を厳禁した。
However, leaders of those countries in Moscow and Tokyo prohibited their soldiers to cross the borderline.
戦った前線の双方の指揮官たちはあと一方で使用を消したかったところ、モロトフと東郷重則のモスクワでの合意により9月16日、ハロ川ノモハンにおけるソ連モンゴル軍と日本満州国軍の戦いは双方が占拠しているラインをもって停戦せざるを得なかった。
So both forces were going to destroy the opponents. However, Japan and Soviet Union, they had to cease the battle.
モスクワのスターリンにとって、モンゴルにおける東方の国境線の若干の特質より、独ソ不可侵条約の締結やヨーロッパにおけるソ連の権益の方がもっと重要であった。
It was more important for Stalin in Moscow to conclude treaty of non-aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union and to have rights and interests at Western country than hold the borderline in Mongolia.
東京の日本政府にとっては満州国西部の国境線における多少の利害より極東地域における安定、イギリス、ソ連との関係の緩和、太平洋全般調整の方が優先された。
For Japanese government, it was more beneficial to obtain stable position in Far East, to have better relationships with England and the Soviet Union, and to obtain Pacific affairs information than fighting over the borderline in Mongolia.
日本満州国軍とソ連モンゴル軍の戦いにおいて、違いも鮮明であった。
There were clear difference between the strategy at the Battle of the Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan between Japan, Manchuria, and Soviet Union, Mongolia as well.
この部分をちょっと時間関係で省略します。
I would like to skip these slides due to
すいません。ハルハ川と国境線に立って戦場を見渡すと、記念碑や記念、標柱、プレートの他に、今に残る戦場の傷跡が実に、むごたらしく目も当てられない。
When I stand at the Khalkhyn River and borderline and oversee the battlefield, it is painful to see monuments, memorial pillars, memorial plates, and scars of the battles.
ここで関係諸国の書籍、映画を含む文学芸術作品における日本語の表彰について触れておきたい。
At this time, I would like to discuss literature and arts which describes Japanese soldiers.
私は2019年から昨年にかけてハルハ川とノモハン、忘れられてはいけない戦争というドキュメンタリー映画の制作に携わった。
I participated creating the documentary film called The Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan, The Forgotten War That Should Not Never Be Forgotten.
その制作にあたって関係諸国が制作したさまざまなハルハ川ノモハン戦争の映画を見ました。
I watched many films about the Battle of the Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan created by different.
これらの映画には日本軍がいかに無感情で殺人の機会であるかという視点が根底にあります。
The films are based on non-emotional and murder machine, how the Japanese forces.
私個人的にこれまでの関係諸国の日本軍に対する表彰をある程度見直す必要があるのではないかと思います。
However, I personally think that we need to change our perspective towards Japanese forces and soldiers.
その理由は次の3点を取り上げたい。
Here, I would like to discuss 3 reasons.
第一に日本軍の将兵は軍の規律はもとより、実に家族、戦友に対する感情を重んじたのです。
First, Japanese soldiers focus not only rules, but also families and fellow soldiers.
日誌日記を例に説明してみよ
う。Let me explain that.
日本軍の将兵は日記を書く習慣があった。
They had a routine to write daily journals.
ハルハ川ノモハン戦争の時、ソ連モンゴル軍は戦場で露獲した日本軍の将兵たちの日記、作戦日誌などから日満軍側の作戦計画の一部を知ることができたということはすでによく知られています。
It is widely known that Soviet Union Mongolian forces obtained Japanese Manchurian forces status through Japanese soldiers' journals.
実際日本軍の将兵の日記の中には軍事についてだけではなく、家庭、家族、戦友に対する思いなどもよく記されています。
In fact, they often wrote about their families and soldiers with their battle status.
例えば私が収集した日本軍の日誌のうち、市長兵第7連隊、第3中隊、のその軍事、忠雄小隊長の日誌には ノマハンでの戦い、所属部隊の移動の記録、写真の他に、戦友への感謝、友情、両親、妻への愛などを示す言葉なども書かれています。彼らの写真なども貼り付けられています。
For instance, I own the journal belonged to platoon leader Tadao Gunji, Japanese soldier. He wrote of the battle in Nomonhan, records of his command movement, and also his photograph and his command photographs, appreciation to his fellow soldiers, friendship, and love for his wife and parents.
これ実際のその日誌です。これノモハンの戦場で撮った写真。
So this is the actual journal and the photograph that he took.
これ彼が妻の妹と一緒に撮った写真。
So this is the leader Gunji, his wife and his wife's sister, which is his sister-in-law.
第2に日本軍の将兵は衛生清潔を保つことを重視した。
Secondly, Japanese soldiers put the value of cleanness and sanitization.
ノマハン戦場でも日本軍の将兵は戦いの合間にドラム缶に水を入れ沸かして風呂を堪能していた。
At the battlefield, Japanese soldiers enjoy to take a bath with 2 drum cans in between battle.
ここでは私はハンダムというモンゴル軍側の看護婦の証言を紹介したい。
I would like to introduce the testimony of the Mongolian nurse, the Miss Hamdan.
1939年8月、15歳のハンダムはわずか3日間の医療の訓練を受けて、看護婦としてハロハ側のモハン戦場に送られました。
Miss Hamdan, who was 15 years old, she was sent to the battlefield as a nurse after completing 3-day medical training in August 1939.
ハンダムは野戦病院に送られたソ連モンゴル軍と日本満州国軍の傷病兵の看護の仕事に携わりました。
She worked to treat both soldiers of Soviet Union Mongolia and Japan Manchuria forces.
彼女は次のように日本軍の傷病兵について証言しています。
She testified about the Japanese soldiers as follows.
日本軍、つまり捕虜たちですね。格好は良かった。綺麗な顔、白い顔をしていた。消毒などの処理において割に簡単だった。
So she testified the Japanese soldiers were good looking. They had a beautiful white face, and it was easy to sanitize their wounds.
すなわち日本軍の将兵は普段だけではなく戦場でもよく衛生を重視するから負傷後消毒などにおいて割に簡単だったということです。
In other words, Japanese soldiers have a routine to sanitize themselves, even at the battlefield. So it was easy for nurses to treat them.
第3に日本軍の玉砕に対する認識です。
The third reason is Japanese value of honorable death.
ハロハ側のモハン戦争に限らず、玉砕は関係諸国の日本軍将兵に関する作品の中で常にクローズアップされる出来事の一つとなっています。
Not only limited to the Battle of the Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan, Japanese honorable death becomes a topic in war-related films.
しかし日本軍の将兵が玉砕する際、自世の句を読み残したことは関係諸国ではあまり知られていない。
However, it is not widely known that Japanese soldiers read a poem before they executed.
中世以降、日本の文人や武士は死に際に漢詩あるいは下注和歌俳句を 読み残すという習慣があった。近代になっても日本語はこの伝統を保っていた。
Since the medieval era, Japanese researchers, intellectual people, and samurai read the poem before they died. So Japanese soldiers kept the tradition during the modern era.
最後にアロハ川あるいはノモハンのどちらかのみに立って1939年のこの出来事を見渡すのでは相手からの視線、立場が見えてこない。アロハ川とノモハンに立って両側の視線を考察することで初めてアロハ川ノモハン戦争をより客観的、深く踏襲することができます。私がこの戦いをアロハ川でもノモハンでもないアロハ川ノモハン戦争と呼ぶのもこうした理由があるからです。
Lastly, you cannot stand and see the opponent's perspective if you stand at either Khalkhyn River or Nomonhan. You need to stand at Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan, then see both sides' perspectives. Then you would understand and visualize the battle of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan clearly and deeply. This is the reason that I call the Battle of Khalkhyn River and Nomonhan, not the Battle of Khalkhyn River or the Battle of Nomonhan.
時間大きくオーバーして申し訳ございません。以上、ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。
I'm sorry for past our time. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, thank you. That was very interesting. I didn't realize you had were these actual copies of the soldiers' diaries or were they like published? I'm sure we can discuss further. And we had several questions already on the chat. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. And after Dr. Husel's presentation, of course, we have the pleasure to invite Dr. Stuart Goldman, who will be presenting about more of the impact and relevance of the significance of the Khalkhyn Gol and aka Nomonhan battle. So Dr. Goldman, as you know, as we mentioned, is an American historian and author, and his most recent book is Nomonhan 1939, The Red Army's Victory. I have the book right here, although I confess I haven't finished it, but it's a fascinating read. It's about the Nomonhan/Khalkhyn Gol. Dr. Goldman got his BA in history from the City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and then went to Colgate University for his MA. He received his Ph.D. from Georgetown University, during which he wrote a dissertation on the Forgotten War, the Soviet Union, Japan, 1937 through 1939. Goldman taught history at Wilson College from 1969 to 1971 and Pennsylvania State University between 1971 and 1978. He then became a specialist in Russian and Eurasian political and military affairs at the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress, where he worked for 30 years. Dr. Goldman has been a scholar in residence at the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research since 2009. And a matter of fact, Dr. Goldman has told us that he speaks less Japanese than Russian. His conversational Russian is way better than his Japanese, although he has lived in Japan for 10 months or even more, right? So thank you, Dr. Goldman. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natsu, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Professor Husel, for your excellent presentation, which brought us down into the grassland. We got our toes into the sand at the Khalkhyn Gol battlefield. My presentation, as Natsu said, is based on a book that I wrote a few years ago. Can we pull up my slides, Natsu? Thank you. Let's go to the slideshow view. Okay, very good. So my presentation is going to be pulling back a bit from what Professor Husel talked about and providing some context. In the first instance, geostrategic context in East Asia, and then a global context to put the Khalkyn Gol conflict into perspective with the outbreak of the Second World War. I am not so please give me control of the slides so that I can move them. But as was explained, this presentation is based on a book, the full title of which is Nomonhan 1939, The Red Army Victory That Shaped World War II, published by the Naval Institute Press. The premise of that book is that up until then, there was an important piece missing in the giant jigsaw puzzle, which is our understanding of the outbreak of the Second World War. When you put that missing piece into place, the whole puzzle makes more sense. And what I argue in this book, and what I'll explain today, is that that missing piece in understanding the outbreak of the war is, in fact, the Khalkyn Gol or Nomonhan conflict. The year after my book was published, it was nominated for the Collins Prize for Book of the Year of Military History, awarded annually by the U.S. Commission on Military History. But I can tell you that this interpretation that I have of linking Khalkyn Gol or Nomonhan with the outbreak of the Second World War is now entering into the mainstream of historiographic studies of the Second World War. I'm still not able to control the slides with my mouse, Nasu. So please jump to the next slide.
All right.
I can summarize my presentation in 4 sentences. First, that the Khalkyn Gol conflict was provoked and escalated by Japan. 2, that this conflict influenced Stalin's decision to conclude the non-aggression pact, which was really a secret military alliance between the Soviet Union and Germany. And the German-Soviet non-aggression pact of August 23rd, 1939, was Hitler's green light to invade Poland, which triggered the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. 3, 2 years later, in 1941, because of the Japanese experience at Khalkyn Gol, that is, the terrific beating that they suffered at the hands of the Red Army, this partly influenced Japan's decision in 1941 for war against the United States. And finally, Japan's decision to strike south, the road to Pearl Harbor, and not to attack the Soviet Union in the latter part of 1941, as the Germans were urging the Japanese to do. The Japanese decision to strike south decisively shaped the conduct and ultimately the outcome of the Second World War. Next slide, please. So let's pull back and get a little bit of context here. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, it acquired a 3,000-mile-long border with the Soviet Union and the Mongolian People's Republic, Outer Mongolia, at that time the only other communist country in the world. Much of that border, especially the Mongolian Manchurian section of the border, was poorly demarcated. There were hundreds of border clashes along the border. Khalkyn Gol was by far the biggest and most important of these. It was not some overgrown border clash. It was, in fact, a small, undeclared war. Over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 1,000 airplanes, 30 to 50,000 men killed and wounded in 4 months of intense combat, May to September 1939. Next slide, please. You're going to hear a lot from me today about the Kwantung Army, which was Japan's army of occupation in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army seized, occupied, and ruled Manchuria and the puppet state of Manchukuo that the Japanese government set up in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army was a proud outfit. They considered themselves an elite force. They were dominated by a group of hot-headed, mid-level staff officers, the colonels who who launched the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, really in violation of the policy of the government in Tokyo, were examples of these hot-headed staff officers. In 1939, the dominant guy in this clique was a character named Tsuji Masanobu. At that time, only a major, but the senior operational staff officer at Kwantung Army headquarters at Sinking. Tsuji personally drafted an order, Kwantung Army Operations Order 1488, which he persuaded the Kwantung Army High Command to promulgate in late April 1939. I'm going to quote from this order that Tsuji drafted. It is permissible to enter Soviet territory or to trap or lure Soviet troops into Manchukuo territory. Where boundaries are unclear, local commanders will establish boundaries. In the event of an armed clash, fight on to victory, regardless of the location of boundaries. Consequences will be the responsibility of Kwantung Army headquarters. It's hardly surprising that just days after this inflammatory order was promulgated, the next little clash between horse-mounted Mongolian and Manchurian border guards blew up into a big fight. Next slide, please. So, because of this order, here's a picture of Tsuji Masanobu. Next slide, please. Because of the order that Tsuji drafted and that Kwantung Army put into place, a minor border clash between horse-mounted border guards on the 11th and 12th of May escalated because the local Japanese area commander, General Komatsubara, who Professor Husel talked about earlier, felt obliged to act on the basis of the new aggressive orders that had just been put in place. And so he sends an infantry regiment, a Kwantung Army infantry regiment from his 23rd Division down to the border area to wipe up the situation and throw what they consider the Mongolian invaders out back across the river, which the Japanese and Manchurians regard as the border in that area. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, unbeknownst to General Komatsubara, the Soviet side, after the skirmishing in early and mid-May, had reinforced their Mongolian allies with several battalions of Soviet mechanized infantry, so that when the Japanese strike at the end of May, instead of encountering just Mongolian cavalry, they meet Soviet mechanized infantry with some light armor and self-propelled artillery. The Japanese have no armor in this fight, and they suffer heavy losses. Kwantung Army was very upset by this, and they decided that they needed to launch a major escalation to, quote, teach the enemy a lesson, close quote. In the meantime, on the Soviet side, in Moscow, the Soviets were becoming more concerned with what appeared to be Japanese escalation. And so they reinforced their client allies in Mongolia. They send a young cavalry officer, a young tank commander named Georgy Zhukov, to take command. And they give him thousands of new troops and a lot of armor. Zhukov is a name that's probably known to many of you. He would go on in the Second World War to become the overall commander of the Red Army. He was something like General Eisenhower and General MacArthur all rolled into one for the Red Army in World War II. Khalkhyn Gol was his first major combat command. Next slide, please. Okay, so Major Tsuji drafts plans for a big offensive to teach the Russians and the Mongolians a lesson. Starts off with a big air raid to smash the planes that the Soviets have sent to Mongolia to back up their allies, in direct violation of orders from Tokyo. And his plan calls for them to build a bridge across the Haha River and cross over into what even by Japanese interpretations of the border, is clearly a Mongolian territory on the west side of the Khalkhyn River. They put 15,000 men across the river, backed up with artillery, to smash the Soviet and Mongolian forces. But the Japanese are so overconfident of their ability to do this that they actually order the aerial reconnaissance of the battlefield area to stop flying because they don't want to tip off the Russians and the Mongolians as to what's coming. Big mistake. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, Zhukov has got 8,000 men in the 8,000 Soviet army men in the battlefield area. More important, he's got a lot of tanks and armored cars. When the Japanese cross the river and attack, Zhukov's armor repels the Japanese, and in intense fighting, July 1st to 3rd, both sides suffer heavy losses, but eventually the Japanese are thrown back across the river. Their attack is a complete failure. Kwantung Army continues to hammer away at the Soviet Mongolian forces around the Khalkhyn River through July and into early August. The Soviet and Mongolian forces repel these attacks and hold their ground. Meanwhile, Zhukov starts planning a big August counteroffensive and receives still more reinforcements from Moscow. Next slide, please. So here's Zhukov with his staff conferring about the offensive that he is planning. Next slide. This is a mock-up of Zhukov's battle plan, which is basically the plan which is going to become Zhukov's signature maneuver throughout the Second World War. He sends his armor, his mechanized infantry and powerful armored formations around the wings to encircle the Japanese while he holds them in place with strong frontal assaults with infantry and artillery at the center. Next slide. Because of continued Japanese intelligence failures, they had no idea of the size of the force that Zhukov had amassed. That was partly because Japanese doctrine believed that it was impossible to conduct major military operations more than 100 or 150 miles from a major railroad line. And the closest Soviet railhead to the battlefield was 400 miles away, whereas the Japanese had a railhead only 50 miles from the Nomonhan battlefield. What the Japanese didn't know is that the Soviets had organized a tremendous shuttle of 4,200 trucks running a round trip day and night, bringing in supplies and men and equipment into the battlefield area. They drove in at night with their lights blacked out, and during the day they returned back across the border into Mongolia to pick up more supplies. When the Japanese saw the trucks during the day headed west back into Mongolia, they thought the Russians were retreating. Wrong. Zhukov's offensive, as Professor Husel explained, was a tremendous success. When we say that an army has been decimated, it means literally that they've lost 1 in 10, from the word decimal. The Zhukov's offensive on August 20th to 30th, 1939, was a battle of annihilation. 75% of Japan's frontline troops were killed in action. Komatsubara's 23rd Division was almost completely destroyed. Total Japanese casualties, more than 20,000. Next slide. Here's a picture of Soviet armor about to go over the hill in their assault against the Japanese, who didn't have anything like the firepower to resist the hundreds and hundreds of tanks that Zhukov threw at them. Next slide. In the aftermath of Zhukov's offensive, sporadic combat continued through early September until on the 16th, there was finally a ceasefire agreed by the commanders on the spot at the battlefield. Eventually, as Professor Husel explained, the Japanese side was forced to accept the Mongolian Soviet interpretation of the border some 12 miles east of the Khalkhyn River. And that's where the border stands today. The Soviet offensive, August 20th to 30th, coincided precisely with the conclusion of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, August 23rd, and the outbreak of the war in Europe on September 1st, a week later. To grasp the connection between these events, we need to stop back and take a look at the global context. Next slide, please. In the mid to late 1930s, you can think of the world composed of three mutually hostile blocs: the fascist militarist capitalists, Germany, Italy, and Japan; the bourgeois democratic capitalists, England and France; maybe the United States and President Roosevelt can overcome American isolation; and the communists, the USSR and the Mongolian People's Republic, a virtual Soviet protectorate and the only other communist country in the world. Of these three blocs, the communist bloc was, by most measures, the weakest of the three. Stalin's nightmare was that all of the capitalists would combine and gang up and destroy the Soviet Union. By the late 1930s, another threat, less scary but very serious, was beginning to emerge, and that was that Germany and Japan alone might combine and attack the Soviet Union and face Stalin with a two-front war, Germany in the West and Japan in the East. Next slide. By 1938, you remember September 1938, the Munich Agreement. Neville Chamberlain betrays Czechoslovakia, forces the Czechs to surrender the Sudetenland, their fortified boundary area with Germany. It looks like Germany is moving east. Hitler tells Chamberlain and the French that the Sudetenland is my last territorial demand in Europe. If you give me this, you won't hear from me again. Everything will be quiet after that. At the same time, the Japanese are plussing up their own aggression in China. They, as you know, they started what amounted to an all-out war in China in July of 1937. And here in mid-1939, it's going strong. So Hitler was moving east. The Japanese were expanding. Germany and Japan were allies of a sort, according to their anti-Comintern pact of 1936, which was nominally directed against international communism, the Comintern, but really was a kind of anti-Soviet alliance. In March of 1939 came a huge game changer. In March of 39, 6 months after Munich, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement, invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and humiliated Chamberlain, who had told the British public that he had brought back peace in our time at Munich. And Hitler, by tearing up the Munich Agreement and invading all of Czechoslovakia, finally demonstrated to Chamberlain that appeasement didn't work, that Hitler's appetite grew with eating. And it was very apparent from that point on that the next item on Hitler's menu was Poland. And within days, the British and French pledged unilaterally to defend Poland in the event of a German attack. That's the end of March 1939. Next slide. So Chamberlain, who detests communism and hates Stalin, concludes, if we the Brits have to actually fight Germany, it sure would be convenient to have the Russians as allies. The Russians are good at that sort of thing. And so grudgingly, the British and French send a military mission to Moscow to try to arrange an Anglo-French Soviet military alliance against Germany. From the British and French point of view, the main hope is that this will deter Germany from attacking Poland. Failing that, if it comes to war, maybe we'll have Russian help in the fight against Germany. Back in Berlin, Hitler knows that he can smash Poland. He's hoping that he can bamboozle the British and French into surrendering Poland again, the same way they surrendered Czechoslovakia, and that there won't even be a fight with the British and French. But he's pretty sure that if the British and French actually honor their commitment to Poland, he can handle them too. What Hitler wants to avoid is the mistake that Germany made in 1914 of fighting England and France and Russia simultaneously. And that gives Stalin an opening, because Stalin understands that Hitler doesn't want a two-front war against the British and French and Russians. And so Stalin, while the British and French are in Moscow trying to negotiate a military alliance with Stalin against Germany, Stalin opens secret talks with the Germans to see if he can work out something with Hitler. So now it's the summer of 1939. While the fighting is raging at Khalkyn Gol, England and France and Germany are all trying to get some kind of agreement with Stalin. And Stalin is in a position where he can choose between an alliance with England and France against Germany or some kind of understanding with Germany. Next slide. Well, we all know the decision that Stalin made. This is the actual photograph of German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop in Moscow, in the Kremlin, on the night of August 23rd, 1939, signing the infamous German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Over his right shoulder is Molotov getting ready to sign after him. And there in the background is Stalin, grinning like a Cheshire cat, because he knows he's got the game in his pocket. Next slide. There are many reasons for Stalin's decision to sign the agreement with Hitler. In the first instance, it sets up a war between the capitalists. The Germans and the Italians are going to fight the British and French and leave the Soviet Union on the sidelines. If I personally were responsible for Soviet foreign policy in 1939, that would be the ideal outcome that I would want to achieve. Let the British and French fight the Germans, leave me out of it. But there's another reason for Stalin's decision to sign with him, and that is that he's got this Japanese problem, that the Japanese have launched this aggression to Khalkyn Gol, and they keep escalating, and they keep escalating. And if Stalin signs an anti-German military alliance with Britain and France and has to fight the Germans, or at least mobilize the Red Army in the West to intimidate Germany, then it's got this Japanese problem on the Eastern Front. And he's looking at the possibility of a two-front war with Germany and Japan. Furthermore, the Japanese were moving heaven and earth to try to get the Germans to sign an ironclad anti-Soviet military alliance. And the Japanese were doing this in secret diplomacy in Berlin. But Stalin knew about it because he had a key spy in Tokyo, a guy named Richard Storga, who was able to warn Moscow that the Japanese were trying to get Germany to conclude an anti-Soviet military alliance. So, by signing the pact with Hitler, Stalin not only sets up a conflict between the capitalists in the West, but it cuts off Japan from its nominal ally Germany, which allows Stalin to turn around and smash the Japanese at Khalkyn Gol, which is exactly what he did. Next slide. Here's a picture of Richard Storga. We'll hear more about him. I maintain that he was the most important spy in the entire Second World War. Next slide. So this idea of mine that Stalin's decision for the alliance with Hitler was partly influenced by his Japanese. I'm sorry, that was someone calling me. Was initially based on my reading of the German diplomatic documents and later confirmed by Soviet archival documents released during the Gorbachev and Yeltsin period. During the secret talks between the Germans and the Soviets leading up to the conclusion of their non-aggression pact, 4 times the German ambassador in Moscow, von Schulenburg, meets with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. And 4 times Schulenburg asks Molotov, what is it that you want from us? What do you need from us? What can we give you to make this thing work? And 4 times Molotov reads Schulenburg a list of Soviet demands, Soviet desiderata. What the Soviets want from Germany. And each time, the first item on Molotov's list is, we want you Germans to get your Japanese buddies to cease and desist their aggression at Khalkhyn Gol, at Nomonhan. Well, the non-aggression pact was, as is well known, more than just a non-aggression pact. It was, in fact, a secret military alliance in which, in the first instance, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed that they would both attack Poland and divide Poland between them. Germany invaded on September 1st. As soon as September 4th, the Germans began buzzing Moscow, saying, okay, it's time for you guys to come in from the east. The Red Army didn't move. September 7th, 8th, 9th, the Germans are asking, okay, come on in, we're waiting for you to attack from the east. The Red Army doesn't move. September 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, the Polish resistance to Germany is collapsing. The Germans are saying, come on already. It's time for the Red Army to move into the east. The Red Army doesn't move. Finally, on September 16th, the day after the conclusion of the ceasefire at Khalkhyn Gol, the Red Army invades Poland. I submit that Stalin was very careful not to start hostilities in the West until he was sure that the fire had been extinguished in the East. Next slide. Okay. It's dangerous to try to put yourself in Stalin's mind and guess what he was really secretly thinking. But I believe that Stalin believed that the fighting in Europe in 1939 would be something like 1914. That England, France, and Germany were more or less equally matched, and they would bleed each other white the way they had in the trenches on the Western Front during the First World War. And that would eventually, when they weakened each other sufficiently, that would leave the Soviet Union as the strongest power, maybe the master of Europe. Well, as we all know, it didn't quite work out that way. Next slide. Imagine you got a TV remote control in your hand. Now fast forward 2 years. It's now June 1941. Hitler tears up the non-aggression pact with Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. Next slide. In the early going, the German successes in their invasion of the Soviet Union, the Operation Barbarossa, were absolutely phenomenal. The German, in 4 months, the German army pushed further into the Soviet Union than the Kaiser's Imperial German army had in 4 years from 1914 to 1918. By autumn of 1941, the Germans had Leningrad surrounded. They were at the gates of Moscow. They'd captured Kiev. Talk about the Battle of Kiev. At the Battle of Kiev, the Red Army lost 1.5 million men. You got that? 1.5 million men in that one battle at Kiev, the encirclement of Kiev. Compare, just for contrast, in the entire Second World War, the United States, in Europe and the Pacific, from 1941 to 1945, suffered about 400,000 men killed. The Red Army lost 1.5 million at Kiev in that one battle. To outward appearances, it looked like the Red Army was on the verge of collapse by the autumn of 1941. And most military observers believed that the Russians were whipped. Next slide. Hitler tells the Japanese, look, this is your chance to get even with that terrific beating the Russians laid on you 4 years ago. Attack the Soviet Far East, but do it now. If you wait 6 months, I won't need you. The war will be over. But the whole Soviet Far East can be yours. I don't need it. I can't reach it. Strike now. But at almost the same time as the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a month later, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan in July of 1941. This was in response to continued Japanese aggression in China and a Japanese move against French Indochina. Almost all the oil in the world that Japan had access to was controlled by the United States and our friends and allies. Japan had very little source of domestic oil production. Who exported oil at 1941? The United States, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, some British colonies in the Persian Gulf. The Japanese can't get Russian oil from Baku. They can't get Romanian oil from Ploiesti. Oh yeah, there's one other place that's a possibility for Japan. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was already a major oil producer and oil exporter. And the Japanese know that they can get that oil because the Netherlands has already been conquered by Germany. There's a handful of Dutch troops minding the store. And so there's a debate in Tokyo about whether Japan should throw in with the Germans and strike north, because many of the Japanese army guards believed that Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was the coming history of the world. But a lot of the Navy guys were desperate to get that oil. Of course, without that oil, the Navy would run dry. And so here in Tokyo, the Japanese are debating, go north or go south. And we know from one of the generals who participated in that debate that one of the most influential army voices that sided with the Navy's position to strike south was our guy Tsuji, who is now, in the summer of 1941, the head of an operations section at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. And Tsuji, he's only a lieutenant colonel at this time, but he's this charismatic, outspoken guy. He can stand up and say, I have experienced Soviet firepower firsthand. You don't want to do that again. I am not arguing that the Japanese defeat at the Russian hands at Khalkyn Gol, or Tsuji's voice, was the dominant reason for the Japanese decision to strike south. No, oil was the main reason for war with America. But we know for sure that their experience of Soviet military capability on the battlefield of Khalkyn Gol, we know that was a significant factor in their decision making. But what if there had been no conflict at Khalkyn Gol? What if Japan didn't have that healthy respect for Soviet military capability? What if they weren't so sure that the Red Army might survive the German attack? What if Japan had done as the Germans were asking and attacked the Soviet Union in 1941? There are many military experts, and I'm one of them, who believe that the Soviet Union would probably not have survived the two-front war, 1941 to 1942. Zhukov was given command of the Red Army at this crucial moment, partly because he had proved himself at Khalkyn Gol. And the coming battle at Moscow would be decisive, because unlike Alexander I, who surrendered Moscow to Napoleon in 1812 without a fight, Stalin decided to stand and fight at Moscow. Not just to make a fight of it, but to hold Moscow at all costs. It would be the decisive battle. Next slide. So in September, October 1941, Stalin's spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorga, is able to inform Moscow that the Japanese have made an irrevocable decision to strike south and not attack the Soviet Union that year. And that gives Stalin the confidence to give the order to move a large part of his Far Eastern military reserves, who've been on the Eastern Front guarding against a possible Japanese attack, to move those forces west to the Moscow front. And in October and November 1941, they moved 15 army divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, and 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft, and loads of artillery from the Far Eastern reserves to the Moscow front. And Zhukov launches a counteroffensive that turns the tide in the war. But what if the Japanese had not attacked Pearl Harbor? What if they had attacked the Soviet Union? Would Stalin have been able to send his Far Eastern reserves east? If the Soviet Union was defeated in a 2-front war, if Germany defeated, let me back up a second. If Germany conquered the Soviet Union, I don't know how the Americans and Brits defeat Germany in Europe. It's quite possible that Europe would be speaking German today instead of English. But that's not what happened. Next slide. On December 6th, 1941, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive from the gates of Moscow. The advanced units of the German army had gotten so close to Moscow that they could actually see the spires of the Kremlin in their binoculars. That's how close they were to Moscow. On December 6th, Zhukov launched a counteroffensive which threw them back 150, 200 miles and held them there through the winter. The next day, on December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, on December 10th, Hitler stupidly and gratuitously declared war on the United States. I don't know how Roosevelt gets Congress to declare war on Germany because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But Hitler solved that problem for him by declaring war on the United States. So the next day, the United States declares war on Germany, and we are in the war. And that, I argue, is the week that doomed the Axis. And that's, in my opinion, what makes the Battle of Khalkyn Gol, the Battle of Khalkyn Gol, or the Nomonhan Incident, the most important World War II battle that most Americans have never heard of. Okay, that's the end of my talk.
All right, thank you so much. I think I especially appreciated the counterfactual what ifs after your presentation, Dr. Goldman. I think we were giving a lot of tips for the creators of these Man in the High Castle TV series that also explore what ifs on World War II events. But I'll also go ahead and invite Mrs. Suda, and then we're open for questions. And actually, let me go ahead and relay the 2 questions that were already in the chat. The first one being, from Hiromichi, we have a question from Dr. Husel, and I guess it could also extend to Dr. Goldman. Can we download the lectures, main points in this presentation available? This is something we can arrange as well. So if the presenters are, if you two don't mind, we can have the presentations as PDF or PowerPoint slides.
That's fine with me.
Okay.
フッスレ教授。
はい。
参加者の方が、
はい。
教授のプレゼンテーションを、ダウンロードしたいとおっしゃってるみたいなんですが、もし先生さえ良ければ、主催者側の方でダウンロードするように、できるように設定していただけるそうなんですが。
いいと思います。
大丈夫ですか？ はい、ありがとうございます。Dr. Fushida, yes, okay.
Thank you. So we also have a question from Naoaki saying they'd like to point out that most of the conscripts were not from samurai class, weren't they? So it's from for Dr. Husel, I think.
So, can I repeat the question again?
So, most of the conscripts, as in the military conscripts of the Kwantung Army, were not from samurai class. So she's asking, they're asking, weren't they?
Where coming from, right?
はい
教授の質問の一つ目として、このハルハ川ノモンハン戦争においての日本軍の兵士たちに関して、侍武士の階級の方が日本軍の軍人として参加してたんでしょ
先ほど、その質問を私も見たんですが、侍級という意味はどういう意味でしょうか。日本では、この1939年の侍級というのはどういうものなのか。
すいません。Naoki Oishi. My name is Naoki Oishi. Can I ask you a question?
Oh,
I
sure.
think the Japanese pre-war government made no ordinary non-samurai class people to think they are as if a samurai or warrior, made them, all of them are warrior. I think today's culture is inheriting that current trend, being that most of the today's Japanese historical drama on TV is 100% from samurai. Samurai supposed to have potential to kill people, but farmers and merchants, those non-samurais, don't kill people. The biggest thing of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Imperial Japanese Army was made all ordinary people made convinced as if they become samurai or hero. That is my reason of asking.
Thank you. That is a very interesting point as well. So modern
samurai is only 10% of the people in the Edo era, and they supposed to commit harakiri if they did a blunder or big mistake, aren't they?
フスレ教授。
はい。
質問してくださった方のこの質問の意図を、説明してくださったんですけれども、今のちょっと長い説明を簡単に要約しますと、江戸時代の、には、侍は 10% しかいなくて、で、武士、侍は人を殺すように、訓練されていた。しかし、農民や商人に関しては、人を殺すということはなく、農業に勤しんだりとか、商いに勤しんだりとしていた、歴史が日本にはあって、ただこのノモンハン、ハルハ川ノモンハン戦争が起こった時のこの帝国陸軍に関しては、この陸軍の日本軍兵士たちは、この侍のように多分訓練、人を殺すように訓練された方が 軍の黒人として、訓練されていたのか、招聘されたどうかという質問と思います。
質問の趣旨。
Thank you very much, translation. But the point in the point is the basic attitudes of Imperial Japanese Army, and it led the ordinary people who are all conflict to let into the war or dying war.
日本語で説明していただいても、
趣旨がよくわからない。
すいません。
英語で。
すいません。要するに、全然、非常に根本的なところに立ち返りますが、普通の一般大衆をあたかも侍が戦うように仕向けて、例えば日記なり、時世の句なりというものを、日本人は真面目に、非常に真面目に訓練されるとやりますけれども、それ自体が非常にいけないことじゃないかと私は思うわけですね。ノモンハン戦争の根本原因の究明とはちょっと違いますけれども、日本の陸軍というものは、陸軍というのは全部、実は日本人すべてなんですが、だと思うんですが、そういうふうに日本の人たちを全部仕向けて戦争に向けたということで、非常に罪が深いと私は思います。我々普通の人間は、普通の日本人はほとんど商人農民で侍ではありません。
So the questioner, so he is explaining that he is commenting his opinion that it is unethical for the Japanese government that the general Japanese people were trained as a killer machine or like a samurai who is trained to kill. So he thinks that a imperial Japanese army train a general Japanese people to be a killer machine is very unethical. Because most are not samurai or not, they don't know how to kill. They are not trained to kill.
Oh, okay. So was this a comment rather than a question?
Yes, comments.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay. All right, yeah, thank you. So, thank you. So the next question is from Muhtamer. It's from both lecturers. Were there any official policies or historical documents about Japan planning to occupy or subjugate the Mongolian People's Republic during or before World War II? Would Dr. Goldman like to start, and then we can move on to Dr. Husel?
Okay.
There were quantum army contingency plans for striking north and west into the Mongolian People's Republic, the so-called Khalkhyn Gol plan, which envisioned such a thrust. But it was a contingency plan, a possibility. It wasn't the Japanese government policy. The fact is that Japan and Russia, even before 1917, had been struggling for control of Northeast Asia, the bones of the crumbling Chinese empire, for years and years. That's what the Russo-Japanese War was about, and a struggle between those two empires over the key part of of the former Chinese Empire in Northeast Asia, Manchuria and Mongolia, was almost inevitable. Maybe Professor Husel can help me out with more detail on this.
フセル教授、質問がありまして、
はい。
質問としては、第二次大戦後、または戦前に、の日本に、モンゴルのこの国境についてのポリシー、または規則などがあったのか、そういう、また書類などがあったのか、どうなのか。
この、もともと、ハロハとフルンベールのその境界線は、もともとは国境線ではなかったです。で、部族の間、ハロハ人と、バルガ人の間の、もちろんダグル人も入るんですが、の境界線で、それは先ほど申し上げたように、陽政12年、1734年に、新政府は、そのハロルという、ラインを作ったのですが、そのラインについては、ハロハ人とバルガ人の間の認識は、ズレはあったのは事実です。ちょっと難しい。じゃあ。はい。
大丈夫。So Dr. Fusule is saying that in Khalkha and Frubein, there was no borderline. There was between Khalkha and Khalkha people and also Balga people had the borderline. In 1974, they made a Haro as a borderline. However, the people in Khalkha and people in Balga had a different understanding of where the borderline is.
当時地図もありました。モンゴル語の地図。
So at that time, they actually had a map in Mongolian language.
このラインについて、ソ連側は地図を、様々な地図を作りました。
So the Soviet Union government, they create several maps regarding.
日本軍側も様々な地図を作りました。
And also the Japanese government create their own map as well, like the Soviet Union government did.
そこの認識ですが、例えば日本側が作った地図の中で、その国境、境界線はハルハ側から引いたものもあれば、その東側から引いたものもあります。ハルハ側より西に引いたものもあります。
So within the Japanese map, there are several maps, and the one has borderline on the east coastline of Halha. The another one has the borderline in the west coast of in Halha.
それで、そして中華民国政府当時作った地図も同じ。ハルハ川を境界線したものもあれば、ハルハ川より東18キロ、ないし20キロ、引いたラインもあります。
Also, Chinese government made a map, and they made a borderline as the Halha River as the borderline, and some map in Chinese government made has the east coastline of the Halha River is the borderline, or the west coastline as a borderline.
先ほど私取り上げた地図の1930、確かに38年、37年かな、関東軍のその地図は、国境線はハルハ川より東です。東側になっています。
The map that I showed that was created in 1937 or 1938, that map was created by Japanese government, and that in that map the borderline is in the more east side of the Khalkyn River.
これは今申し上げた関東軍参謀部の方、1937年に作った地図、極めて正確に、このラインを引いています。
So on this map, it was created in 1937. It is pretty accurate. They're created by a Japanese government.
今日最初に見せた地図のところですが、これ1899年清朝時代に作った地図ですが、同じくこれハロハ川ですね、ノモハンプルドーボ、このラインはここに引いています。
The first map that I showed you, which is created by New Kui Dynasty, New Kui government, 1999, the Halha bowl of woe is right there. And I'm sorry, I think he pointed it.
ですからそこに対するつまり関東軍側は知らないわけではないです。そこにラインあるのは知ってます。
So that means Japanese government knew that there was a borderline in the Halha bowl of woe, which the new Qing government made.
これについて私の本でも、そして二木先生、大堀さんが書いた論文の中で全部触れています。
So this topic is actually written in my book that I wrote with Mr. Futaki and other authors. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Well, if that was everything, I'll just great answer. Thank you both. We do have one comment from Tomoya saying, although some military personnel have expressed their willingness to attack the NPR in unofficial comments or personal opinions, no official Japanese army plan to attack the NPR has ever been created. The Operation Number 8 plan was discarded as a trial draft and was never completed as an official plan. So thank you for that, Tomoya. That's a good comment. So next we have Jeffrey Ballard raising his hand. So please go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Good evening. My question was specifically for both of the hosts. As far as for the initial border clashes that were going on, can you speak any to the Kashan Island, the Lake Kashan incident in 1938? I believe the Japanese called it the Changgung Fu incident. I know seems like it was a mini rehearsal for the Battle of Khalkyn Gol. After that, an early success. I know that the Japanese were able to occupy Russian territory, but were actually pushed out and suffered more casualties. Could you speak specifically to how this may have influenced the Kwantong army's staff as far as being hot-headed with their initial actions, even though they've saw basically a prelude to this battle?
Yes, there is in fact a clear link between the fight at Lake Hassan, or Zera Hassan in Russian, and in July and August 1938, and the fighting at Khalkyn Gol a year later. And the link is this, that even though the territory, first of all, that fight was more than 1,000 miles away in a totally different part of the border, far, far, far from Mongolia. But it was on the Soviet, it was very near the point where the Soviet and the Korean and the Manchurian borders come together in a tripoint. And even though the territory that was in dispute was Manchurian and Soviet territory, the operational Japanese army that had responsibility for defense at the Lake Hassan was not the Kwantung Army. It was the Japanese Army of Korea, Chosungun, and they took a much more controlled attitude toward the fighting. And when the fighting was over, the Soviet side had prevailed and enforced their interpretation of the border of Manchukuo that the Chosungun, the Japanese Korean army, was defending, but that the Kwantung army felt was their responsibility. And in November of 1938, none other than our guide Tsuji Masanobu leads a reconnaissance mission to the border area where the fighting was, finds that the Soviets are in control of the disputed area, which the Japanese believe is Manchukuo territory, which Kwantung Army is sworn to defend. And that's part of the motivation for Tsuji drawing up the plans for that Kwantung Army Operational Order 1488, so that this doesn't happen again on the border. The Kwantung Army officers will be much more vigilant in defending the Manchurian border.
フスレ教授。
はい。
質問としては、お二人の教授に、対してだったんですけども、1938年に起こった、クシュテンポ事件。
わかった。張古峰事件です。はい。
の、戦いにおいて、関東軍に与えた影響とはどういうものなのか、少し教えてください。ということです。
あくまでも私個人の認識ですが、ノモハン事件は実際一部の関東軍のその指揮官はやはり張古峰事件に対する最初の考え方、それ見返しですか？やり返しですか？そういう考え方で、少し教訓を与えようということで、ノモハンでこういう出来事が、起こったのではないかと私個人的にそう思っています。つまり張古峰事件がなかったらこのノモハン事件も、どうなったかは、非常に難しいと思います。
Dr. Fushule, it's personal recognition or the understanding of the Changun incident, and also how they affect this Khalkyn River and Nomonhan incident is part of a Kanto army who was participated in Khalkyn River and Nomonhan incident. They participated to revenge for the Changun incident. However, the Dr. Fusule insisted that this is his personal opinion. And also, if this Changun incident didn't happen, maybe this Khalkyn River Nomonhan incident might not happen, or they had different result.
張古峰事件、張古峰事件ですね。
So that was a Changun Fun incident. I'm
okay,
sorry.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we're bit pressed for time as we budget 2 hours for this event, and it's already 2 hours, but I think I'll just, if it's okay, if there are no more questions, I'll just ask one question from both the speakers, and then we'll end it. As I said before, the abridged version of this event will be on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/ACMS Mongolia. If you'd like to be considered for our future events, please go to the bit.ly list behind me. But so I wanted to ask, Mongolia and Japan, have been intertwined, through this fateful event, and there are many, as Dr. Husel mentioned, there are many diaries, journals from Japanese soldiers, and there were some friendships, lifelong friendships between Japanese and Mongolian peoples, civilians, and maybe also ex-veterans. So how much, how well known are these post-war civilian partnerships? That's more, I guess, for Dr. Husel. For Dr. Goldman, I wanted to ask, at the time, how come the Battle of Khalkhyn Gol or Nomonhan Incident was, not as much known in the West as it was in maybe Mongolia and Russia, despite having such a broad scale and scope? Why was it not that much covered in the West? Because we're getting the idea that it wasn't as well known as perhaps other battles in the other theaters of the World War II. So. Oh, sorry, Dr. Husel, I think first, yeah.
フスレ教授。
はい。
最後の質問として、フスレ教授に対しては、このモンゴルと日本の、この関係についてなんですけれども、フスレ教授がプレゼンテーションの中でお話ししていただいたように、日記、日本兵に対する日記だとか、日本兵には日記だとか、ジャーナルを、つける習慣があって、で、歴史が進むにつれて、モンゴルと日本は、だんだん親しくなって、モンゴルと日本の、友好関係っていうんですかね、が良くなっていった。ということに関して、日本人、またはモンゴル人はどのようなことを知っているんでしょうか？
何について知ってる？互いのことでしょうか？
そうですね。この歴史だとか、どういう、歴史を経て今に至っているのか。
はい。どうもご質問どうもありがとうございます。じゃあ私。
Thank you very much for the question.
日本とモンゴルについて、まず日露条約4回の秘密条約、普段3回と言ってますが、実際4回も日露条約を締結しました。
So between Japan and Russia, there has treaty 3 times, but it's technically they concluded treaty 4 times.
その中でモンゴルと関しては、簡単で申し上げると、外モンゴルは当時失礼しました。ロシアの勢力範囲に、置かれました。
So within the treaty, and they mentioned about the Mongolia.
外モンゴル。
And the outer Mongolia was under control of the Russia.
内モンゴルの東部は日本の勢力範囲下に置かれました。
The east side of the inner Mongolia was under the control of Japanese government.
ですから外モンゴルは1911年独立宣言をして、その中独立が消されて1921年 再び独立を宣言して24年に人民共和国になったのですが、これはずっとロシアのちのソ連勢力範囲下に置かれていた。
So Outer Mongolia, they declared independence in 1911, and they declared that another independence in 1921 and 1924. They claim that the Outer Mongolia is a people's country. However, after that, before that, the Outer Mongolia was under control by a Soviet Union of Russia.
これに対し、内モンゴルの東部は、満州国成立したことによって、満州国領の一部になったんですね。1932年。
On the other hand, 1932, the east side of the Inner Mongolia was under the control of Manchurian country or government.
内モンゴルの東部とフルンボエル。
It was in the east side of the Inner Mongolia.
内モンゴル西部はデムチクトンルボーの政権が樹立されたんですね。
ごめんなさい、もう一度お願いします。
内モンゴルの西部
は
デムチクトンルボー、デワンというデワン、デムチクトンルボー。
ボンチク。
デムチクトンルボーですね。日本では徳王と言ってますが、大変有名で。
ボンチク。
デムチクトンルボー。
はい。
デムチクトンルボーって言えば。
デムチク。ボードオーバー。
すいません。
はい。And the west side of the Inner Mongolia was under the control of Borjigin Husel.
で、結局第二次世界大戦終結に伴って日本はアジア大陸から退出することになったのですが、内モンゴルの東部も西部も内モンゴル全体とフルンベールは結局中華人民共和国の一部になりました。
After the World War II, Japan had to leave from the Asian continent. In that sense, the Inner Mongolia, east and west, and also Funan Boyo was under the control of the Chinese government.
この歴史の流れを見ると、内モンゴルはずっと日本と関係が第二次世界大戦終結までは密接な関係を持っていました。密接な関係になっていました。
As you can see, the Inner Mongolia and Japan has a close relationship until the end of the World War II.
第二次世界大戦終結後、モンゴル国のその国連加盟と日本のその国連復帰においても当時1955年56年の時ソ連の方は同時に加盟するという案を提出したんですよ。
After the World War II, Japan and Mongolia was trying to be involved in the United the national organization.
残念ながら当時の中華民国ですね、否決権を行使したために同時加盟はできなかったんですね。
However, because of the Chinese government's disagreement, the Japan or Mongolia was not able to join the United Nations at the same time.
結局モンゴル国の方は遅れて1961年 に加盟したのです。
Mongolia was participated in United Nations in 1961, later than Japan.
冷戦後、日本を中心に、先進国がモンゴル国を支援するという体制を作ったんですね。
So after the Cold War, Japan hosted and to support the Mongolia.
それで最近よく、つまり東アジア諸国の間に歴史に対する認識がなかなか統一できなくて、歴史認識をめぐって、対立が非常に激しいですね。
So lately there is a strong disagreement, regarding East Asia or Far East Asia.
そこでよく言われるのは、なぜ日本とモンゴルの間は、この歴史の対立を乗り越えることができたかということ、日本とモンゴルの関係から関係諸国は何を学ぶべきか、よく今議論されています。
So lately, all the countries discuss about how Japan and Mongolia overcame their history and history background and have a good relationship as a countries.
日本の新聞の記事でも掲載されたことがありますが、日本とモンゴルは対立から友好への道を歩むことができた。これ一種のモデルではないかと、関係諸国もこのことから何かを学ぶべきではないかという、考え方ですね。
So one of the Japanese articles says that this Japanese and Mongolia country relationship that they overcame their the disagreement, also the battles, and became friendly countries. The article says that all the countries should learn from how Japan and Mongolia overcame this crisis.
Great, yeah, thank you. So thank you for that. I'll turn it over to Dr. Goldman. How were the Khalkyn Gol battles sort of happened under the radar in the West, or were they going under the radar? Were they covered at all in the West?
That's a good question, Nasa. And there are a number of factors for why Khalkyn Gol remained, as Dr. Husel called it in the title of his book, The Forgotten War, or as I suggested in my talk, the most important World War II battle that most people have never heard of. Why is that? In the first instance, the battlefield is in as remote and godforsaken a part of the world as you can imagine. There were no Western war correspondents there covering, writing about the combat. Furthermore, both Tokyo and Moscow kept the fighting quiet. They both had good reasons to keep it quiet. On the Japanese side, they kept it quiet because they kept losing. On the Soviet side, they kept it quiet during the fighting because the fighting at Khalkyn Gol coincided with Soviet negotiations with Germany. And the fact that Stalin had this Japanese problem would weaken his hand in dealing with the Germans. So both Moscow and Tokyo kept it quiet while it was going on. More important still, it was everyone who was interested in world affairs could see that Germany was getting ready to attack Poland. The eyes of the world were focused on the German-Polish border, on the Polish corridor, on Danzig. And when the fighting at Khalkyn Gol ended, the Second World War began. And the eyes of the West were focused on the war in Europe. Finally, even today, most historians are trained geographically. so that the Asian historians, like the Japanese scholars, who are very familiar with Khalkhyn Gol, or Nomonhan Incident, as they call it, view it as a relatively obscure East Asian military episode that ended in 1939, and that was the end of it. The European historians who are looking at the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, they look at England and France and Germany and Poland. It doesn't occur to them to look at Mongolia to see why the war began in Europe. It requires this kind of global perspective to pull the pieces together.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to Naoki-san for his comments as well in the chat. We have some, for the really positive notes of further collaboration that happened after the World War. And obviously, as most of you know, Japan and Mongolia are now strategic partners, and the partnership is very deep. And I think it's our hope that through this presentation, the Battle of Khalkyn Gol or Nomonhan will be more known and more appreciated for its scale and significance to the World War II for a wider audience of scholars and everyone. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank both our speakers as well as Mrs. Suda, Batoka-san. Thank you for your wonderful interpretations. Thank you to our audiences. So thank you very much, and we're about to finish now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.